So why don't we begin? Good afternoon, everybody. As we're getting our food, please help yourself. Let me introduce our speaker for today. I am Paul Peterson. I am the director of the program on education policy and governance here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And this is being made available to people online as well. So, and will be available afterwards if you have friends who want to hear the discussion. But we're very fortunate today to have Stephen Bowen with us. He is the executive director of the Hoover Education Success Initiative at Stanford University. But the reason we have him today, especially, is that he is so experienced in the state policymaking world in a variety of capacities. He has not only been the Commissioner of Education for the state of Maine, he's also been a member of the state legislature in that state and an advisor to the governor on education policy prior to becoming the commissioner. And he has served the Council of Chief State School Officers, allowing him to look at state policy making and the requirements of state governance from in virtually every state of the country. So we have an authoritative voice on the challenges and opportunities that emerge when you have a system of education that is ultimately responsible to the state. So thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us today.
Thanks, Paul. Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. My daughter lives nearby, and I got down here last night in time to go and have some dinner with her, and we were walking across over here someplace, and she said, presenting at Harvard. Can you imagine? Did you ever imagine? I grew up on a chicken farm in rural Maine. She's like, did you ever imagine you'd be doing a presentation at Harvard? I did not. So I'm really thrilled to be here. What I wanted to do today, you'll see at your spaces this little policy tool that we built. And I wanted to share that with you because the question I want to explore with you all today is, I think, a key challenge that we have, that those of you who are researchers and scholars and academics have, which is, how do we get information and research into the hands of policymakers in ways that they will actually use it? And so I would shift the title of my talk a little bit to be more like sharing with policymakers the lessons learned from the Nation at Risk +40 series that we did. So the real challenge is, we at Hoover, just as I'm sure I know happens here at Harvard, generate a lot of research, a lot of papers, a lot of material and resources that we hope policymakers will use. The challenge is, how do we get them to use it? And I want to preface my remarks today by noting that I am not a scholar. So I just want to get that on the record. I had an academic career with a distinct lack of distinction. But I was brought to Hoover specifically because I did have a policymaking background. And the Hoover team, to their credit, wants to have impact. It's a public policy think tank. They want research by our fellows like Michael Hartney to have impact, to get into the hands of policymakers. And so my job is to sit in this sort of space between the scholars and the academics who are doing the real research and the policymakers who are in state legislatures in Nebraska, who we hope will use this research for good. So the challenge that we have as an organization at Hoover is, how do we do that? So what I wanted to do today is a couple of things. I want to sort of share with you this set of work that we did around looking back at a nation at risk, and share with you the tool that we built that came out of that as an example of how we think we can reach policymakers in a way that we hope will be effective and impactful. So that's kind of my goal. What did we learn from this? Why did we even do this Nation at Risk retrospective series? What did we kind of learn from it? And then how do we take those learnings and turn it into something tangible that policymakers could use? So that's what I'd like to do. So let me start, and I have my back to the screen here, so I'm just going to guess at which slide I'm at back there. So one of the ways that we do this at Hoover, so the Hoover Education Success Initiative is a project of the education team at Hoover. And what distinguishes us from the other education work that is done there is we have a practitioners council, which you can find online at the Hoover site, which is state legislators, practitioners who are in the field, district superintendents in the field, who we use as a little bit of a sounding board. What kind of research do you need in the field that would be helpful? And then once we've done research that you think would be helpful, how can we get it back to you in ways that are actually going to be useful to you? We generate lots of 60, 70, 80-page papers with lots of math equations in them. I don't know that state legislators that I serve with are going to read a lot of those. So like, how do we turn that into something that's useful? So when I first got to Hoover, we said, all right, like what would be helpful to the field? We were coming out of COVID, as you all know. There was a lot of push, like we've got to do something here. We've got these huge COVID learning gaps. We need to respond to that somehow. And one of the questions that emerged early on from the group is like, look, it feels like we've been doing education reform for years. Like we're constantly, endlessly reforming. There's all kinds of reform things happening. What has happened as a result of any of that? Like what resulted from that effort? So we came up with this idea of, we were coming up on the 40th anniversary of A Nation at Risk. As I'm sure most of you know, Nation at Risk was a landmark education study that was released in 1983. There's a fascinating story around its development by the Reagan administration, and they didn't want it done, but the secretary did it anyway. And there's a whole fascinating story about how that report came out. But it was an absolute earthquake when it landed. It was one of the most popular government reports of all time, and really did stimulate a lot of the education reform initiatives that resulted in the years to come. The accountability movement, the assessment movement, the standards movement, school choice, charter schools, a lot of those things that we've seen over the last 40 years are downstream from that report, which really said we have to up our game in terms of our K-12 education. So what we did was we went to a group of scholars. We said, we would love for you to back up a little bit and look at what's happened in 12 different areas. So we kind of took the landscape and we said, all right, we're going to need a couple papers on teaching. We need a paper on governance models. We need a paper on accountability. We need a paper on finance. We need a paper on school choice. And so we had all these papers crafted. And we had those, what we told those scholars is, we want you to back up, give us a sense of like what was tried in the shadow of A Nation at Risk, and then what came of it. Like, what did we learn from efforts in that specific area? And I'm sure we left some things out. There were pieces we probably didn't address, but the idea was to get a sense of that. And so that's what we did. And you can find those online. It's a whole series of papers. It's a book, actually. And let me give you a few of the findings that the scholars came up with, because it influenced kind of the decisions that we made about how we reach policymakers. So I won't go into this in any length. I've grabbed a couple of sort of quotes here and there from these papers. You can go in and read them as well. One of the things we did to reach policymakers is I went into each paper and crafted a one-page version of that paper, which I realized in retrospect, I could have had AI do in probably 30 seconds. It took me about 3 days to do it. But nevertheless, I know from my experience working with policymakers that at some point you got to have that one pager. You got to boil it down to one page. Painful as that might be for some of you who spend a lot of time building out these research pieces, to have to like get it down to literally just a few hundred words that's going to go in front of a policymaker. So these are just some samples of things that we found, and I won't read them all to you, but the basic idea is the researchers who went back said, okay, well, in this particular area, the answer is, well, it kind of depends. So this first one on preschool, the answer on preschool is, well, preschool works if it's done in certain ways, like if it's done in high quality and the people are trained and you've got good curriculum, like it works. But you have to kind of do it in certain ways. This one on adding resources to schools that Rick Hanushek wrote for us, the answer is, well, it depends. I mean, adding money to schools can work if you spend it in certain ways. If you can spend it in other ways and it doesn't have any impact at all. So it sort of depends how you spend it. We had Tom Vander Ark, a technologist, write us a paper about looking at technology implementation and the rollout of computers and all of those kinds of things. And his answer, like so many others, was, well, if it's done well, it can have impact. Most technology implementation in K-12 education was not done very well. It was done haphazardly. There wasn't really a strategy behind it. We bought lots of computers and kind of rolled them out, created computer labs. Teachers weren't trained on it. So, if you did it thoughtfully and you did it over the long term and you built teacher training around it and you kind of did it the right way, it worked. So there was a lot, the theme, and let me hit you with a couple more. The themes that kind of emerged was, well, if you do it well, it can work. But a lot of these things have not been done well, and they've struggled to scale and they've struggled to have impact. So here's just three more, like reducing class sizes. Well, there's a lot of research around reducing class sizes. Sometimes it can work, but the trade-off is when you reduce class sizes, you're consuming resources you could put to something that might have more impact. So it's hard to say that in and of itself, reducing class sizes has an impact. Again, it depends. Whole child reforms. We had somebody look at, okay, we've done a lot of work around whole child, community school, wraparound services. And again, the research is, well, there's actually not a good conclusive evidence that says these whole child kind of wraparound service type community school models actually work in and of themselves. There are places like Harlem Children's Zone where they worked pretty effectively, but we don't really know whether it was the nature of the programming that was done or it was the services or the combination. So we don't actually have good research on that. Even accountability, right? Standards-based accountability, which was kind of the big piece that came out of that era. I mean, we did see performance gains and we saw test-based accountability scores and graduation rates go up kind of in the late 2010s. We think that was due to the actions that schools and districts took under No Child Left Behind, but we also know that those scores leveled off and started declining well before COVID and even before ESSA was enacted that sort of backed off a lot of the federal level policy as it regarded things like school improvement. So accountability kind of worked for a while for certain groups of kids and certain subject areas, but it's hard to say that it worked uniformly everywhere. So the takeaway from all of this has been, and this is from Mackie Raymond's paper. She's one of our fellows at Hoover. He took on the tough task of looking across these 12 papers and reaching some conclusion. Like, what have we learned about education reform based looking across all of these papers? And she did identify areas where it looked like things had made some headway. She identified areas where there seemed to be a lot of headway. And what she said is, and these are the quotes I pulled, right? 40 years of scattershot reforms have failed to improve student learning at scale, right? We've tried a lot of different things. They've worked in some places, not worked in others. But on the whole, we haven't really moved the needle in the way that we had hoped. And interestingly, where she landed was we actually have an impressive record, though, of what not to do. It's tough to get to what to do because education, as you guys know, is so context dependent. We actually have a pretty good sense of what not to do. So the task, though, is how do we get policymakers to think about the things that they shouldn't do and should not do as they're developing policy? So that's what's leading to this tool that I'm going to share with you in a minute. So we're like, all right, we need to boil all this down into some type of finding. Mackie's paper speaks to this, but even Mackie's paper is a long paper. We got to get that boiled down to something. How can we give policymakers something that they can actually use that makes use of these lessons learned from the papers? So we did two things. One, we did these one pages I told you about. So if you go to the Nation at Risk, and you go to the web, and I'll give you the link to it in a bit. If you go to the link where this toolkit is, you will find one-page versions of all of those papers that I did. And again, the idea was, this is something you want to talk to a policymaker. That policymaker is super busy. They have 30 seconds. You need to give them this thing that's one side of one piece of paper, and that's probably the best you can do. And if you're lucky, they'll read the top half of it, and they probably won't get to the bottom half. So you don't have a lot of time. These are busy people. So we did that, and then we built this tool, which I'll talk about in a minute. And what we took advantage of was this framing that Mackie built, because she said, all right, look, how do we summarize the sort of challenges around implementing education over the last 40 years? So she landed on this framing called the 6 I's. And she said the 6 I's kind of characterize the struggles that we've had around education reform: impulsive, incremental, incoherent, impatient, intransigent, and ineffective. So when you read her paper, she sort of fleshes those out. But when she got that done, I thought, it feels like we could do something with that. If we could put something in front of policymakers where they go, all right, how do I address these various challenges? So what we did is we built the toolkit that you've got as a way to kind of take this structure and turn it into something that policymakers could use to evaluate, are they thinking about whatever education reform they're trying to put forward? Are they thinking about it in the right way? So that was the challenge. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through some of those findings, those 6 findings. But what I really want to do is talk about this document a little bit. And selfishly, I'd love when I get done to get a little feedback from you about it, because I do think this is a challenge that all of us have in trying to get policymakers to pay attention to what the research is telling them and giving it to them in ways that's actually useful to them. And I'll explain a little bit why we went in the direction we did with this tool. So let me go through these really quickly. What you have in the tool is we have on each page, we have those 6 sections. Each of the 6 sections has a little blurb that explains what the challenge is, and then it has some self-assessment questions for policymakers to ask themselves that we hope, if they think about it in the right way, will address that challenge. So, for instance, here's the first one, overcoming impulsiveness. What we know is that policymakers latch onto an idea that might have worked in some other place, and then they decide, we'll try that here. And they literally will go to conferences and they will get bill language from a bill that was passed in some other state, and they will come to their state and they will enact that legislation. And they will say to themselves, well, we've solved that problem because Mississippi solved that problem, or Florida solved that problem, or Ohio solved that problem. We'll just do what they did and it will solve our problem too. And the research says, well, not really, because education is really context dependent and they may have an entirely different context than you have. So our self-assessment questions here are, what evidence do you have that this is even going to solve, this is the right approach to even solve the problem that you're trying to solve? How do you know that that's the right solution that you've got? Have you looked at any past efforts to solve this problem? Because again, one of the things that policymakers struggle with is a lot of them haven't been there for very long, right? We talked earlier in Paul's class around turnover of state legislatures, right? You can guess on average that within every legislative cycle, 1/4 to 1/3 of legislators turn over. There's new members to the legislature. They come in thinking they've got a brand new idea. That's probably an idea you've been fighting about in the legislature for 20 years, but they don't know that. So they come in and want to start this idea too. And legislators are, and I say this as a former legislator, infamous about no rear view mirror. We don't look at what previous legislatures tried to do. We're just going to take our bill and run with it. So we ask our policymakers, have you even looked at whether anybody's tried to solve this? And what did you learn from that? And then last, and maybe most importantly, how do you know that if you do what that state did, do you even know what the kind of conditions on the ground are that made it work? And are those conditions in place where you're trying to implement this reform? How do you know that just picking this up and transplanting it someplace else will actually work? So the goal here again is to get policymakers in it. And you'll know one thing, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which is we're being policy agnostic here. I'm not telling them what their reading policy should be or their accountability policy should be. All we're asking them to do is go, did you think about this? Did you think about this? Did you think about this? That's the whole purpose of this tool, right? So that's the impulsiveness one. I'm going to run through these quick, and then I want to talk about the tool a little bit. The next one was this idea of moving past the margins, right? This speaks to this incrementalism. When you talk to district level leaders, they are exhausted by this churn of reform, right? Every legislative session, there's more bills, there's more things that come along. Things just continue to, like little bite-sized chunks, right? And legislators do this because a tiny reform off to the side, maybe a little grant program or something like that, pretty easy to get through the legislature. Doesn't ruffle a lot of feathers. It doesn't make a lot of the sort of vested interest angry, and you can kind of slide it in there. So history is replete with these kind of marginal reforms that were implemented, and they just start to stack on top of each other, all of these small scale changes. And what people lose track of is over time, they stack up. And when you go to talk to the districts and the district superintendents, every session, every legislative session, there's more and more and more of these things. And no one ever goes back to do anything about it. When we were talking with the class earlier, I did a little research on from the National Council of State Legislatures. They said that in the 2023-2024 legislative session, 9,000 education bills were put forward across the 50 states and state legislatures. 9,000 pieces of legislation. That's just in this current legislative cycle. We just had elections. All kinds of new legislators are going to take office in this coming year to launch the next legislative cycle. They're going to introduce another 9,000 bills that people are going to have to deal with. Like, it just keeps coming. So what we've asked here is, hey, policymaker, before you, I know you just got newly elected. I know you're chomping at the bit to go make an impact, but have you stopped to figure out whether, before you launch something new, is there an existing policy or practice you could like build on? Could you adapt something that's in place rather than start something new? Have you done some kind of root cause to figure out why the attempt that was made before didn't actually work? Like, have you dug into underneath all of this, what are the sort of systemic challenges that may be getting in the way? And if your proposal is kind of a limited one and it's not a full-scale proposal, whether it's a reading program or what it might be, what is your plan to scale this? I mean, is your plan that we're just going to do this little thing off to the side, add it to the stack of other little things and hope for the best? Or is your plan that we're ultimately going to scale this thing so we'll have a broad impact across the entire state? So again, we're policy agnostic about this. Doesn't matter to me what policy you're trying to pursue, but you've got to think about this idea of addressing this incrementalism that happens all the time. The next one, and again, I know I'm going fast, and I will stop for questions, I promise. The next one is around coherence. This feeds from the last one. One of the biggest challenges, and when I was at CCSSO, the Council of Chief State School Officers, we did a project on this, around just the incoherence of state education policy. And again, this comes from legislatures over time, passing bills, regulations being put in place, budgets being passed, and other agencies doing things that it just doesn't add up anymore, right? And so we don't do systemic change. We kind of bolt things on to what's already in place. So one of the things we ask policymakers, again, could you pump the brakes and do what's called an initiative inventory? Can you just stop and figure out, what are you already asking the school districts to do? Like, have you put on a list, what are the requirements that you've already, between you and the feds, are already putting on these districts? One of the things that I think about when we were doing this is when I was the commissioner in Maine, you'd get pushback from superintendents around data collection, for instance. Each different part of the agency was collecting data. And so the superintendents were like, I don't know how many times I've sent this same piece of data to your department, to different people. Does anybody in your department talk to anybody else in your department? Because we're just getting killed with data requests down here. Can you guys build some kind of coherence inside the agency around how you're handling these things? So again, what are the questions? Have you looked at the initiative inventory? Have you talked to stakeholders and engaged them in a discussion about, what if we did this? What impact would this have on the things we asked you to do 2 years ago? What impact would it have on the things that you're already having the works that you're trying to do moving forward? Can we get you to engage these things? And, have you figured out ways to build more, just stop as an agency and build more coherence? You've got a lot of grant programs. We worked as part of that project with Colorado, and it was just looking at all the different grants that were going out the door of the agency, right? Agencies love grant programs because they can target them. They're around a specific sort of thing they're trying to do, but they end up with this huge pile of grants going out the door. Now, if you're a big school district who can afford to hire a grant writer, you can access all kinds of grants. But if you're not, you don't have the bandwidth to do all of these grants. So you had a situation where big districts were getting lots of grants, other districts were not getting any grants. Sometimes the grants were in conflict with each other. So the agency took a bunch of time to at least get a list on the wall of what are all the grant opportunities, what are they trying to do, and can we align, eliminate, merge, those kinds of things. So it's about, how do we create more coherence? So we're asking policymakers to do that. The next is this idea of impatience, right? What we find, and this is something I think you get with a democracy. People get elected, they go and knock on doors. I did when I was ran for the legislature. You promise, we're going to create jobs, we're going to improve health outcomes, we're going to make our schools better, you're going to do all these things. You are under, and you have a 2-year term. So you're, as a policymaker, you're under a tremendous amount of pressure to do something about these problems. And so policymakers, what we find is, as we looked across the research, lots of things were launched that seemed to get off to a promising start, and then everybody just went on to something else. Like a new group of people came in. There was never a coalition built that could keep this thing going after those policymakers moved on. And so things kind of drop off the radar. Sometimes you're fortunate that you build some continuity. We talked this morning a little bit like, there are a lot of states where there's turnover at the state education agency, like the state chief turns over a lot. Massachusetts is on the fortunate side of that because you've had like 3 commissioners over the course of 25 years or something like that. There are states that have 3 commissioners in a year. So that kind of churn is a huge problem, particularly for the people at the school and the district level who are just seeing these things sort of coming constantly, and nobody has any patience to wait and see whether something is going to bear fruit. Some of these things that we do in education, like teacher training, right, or implementing new instructional materials, it takes a while for those things to start having impact. And so our questions to the policymakers are, what does success look like? How do you, if this is working, how are you going to know whether it's working? And what are the data pieces that you're collecting to demonstrate that? And are you tracking those over time? And are you figuring out like how you're going to know whether it's working or not? And how do you continue to improve it and refine it? And at what point are you going to say this actually isn't working, and so we need to get rid of it and do something else, right? And can you build some kind of bipartisan support to keep this thing going after people have churned over? In some states, there are states like Kentucky's a state where they've done a tremendous amount of work on like college and career readiness, post-secondary transitions, because they've had governors that are on the sort of same page. So there's not a lot of lurching back and forth, and they've had some continuity over time. But that's the exception to the rule. So our ask of policymakers is, could you think about how you're going to make sure that this is going to continue and not just get forgotten and replaced by something else, so that we have some type of patience for these things to come along, because people get burned out. All right, 2 more, and then I promise we'll stop for a bit. Implementation is this, I mean, you guys know this, but we talked in the class this morning about, for those of you who were teachers, know your experience of going back to school in the fall, and you have your teacher work days before the kids come back, and some type of new initiative is being launched in the school, and it's a new reading program or a new math curriculum or a new this or a new that. And you have a couple of days of professional development as school starts in the fall. You're trying to get your classroom ready, and you've got to go do these other things. And the school is very gung-ho about it. And then it just kind of peters out and everybody goes back to what they were doing. And policymakers don't spend a lot of time thinking about implementation. Like and I will say again, as a legislator, your job is done when the bill passes. Like when you get your bill through the committees, you get your bill past the floors, you go to the governor's office, you have the signing ceremony, and the governor does the thing and hands out the pens to everybody, and you do a big thing on the Capitol steps. And then the legislature goes home. Remember, most legislatures are citizen legislatures. There's a few states with full-time legislators, but most legislators, they legislate for a couple months a year, and then they go back and run an electrical supply store, or they're a dairy farmer, or whatever it is. And as far as they're concerned, the work is done. And then they hand it to the departments to then execute. And I've lived on both sides of this, right? So when I was on the legislative side, I would go to the departments and say, why aren't you guys executing these things? We passed these bills, go make it happen. I don't understand. You're dragging your feet, you bureaucrats. And then, of course, when I switched and went over to the executive branch side and was at the department, it was completely the opposite. It was, why don't they leave us alone? The legislature doesn't know what they're doing. Don't they know we're already on top of this? What are they doing? Can't they leave us alone and let us do our jobs? Why are they in our faces all the time? So that implementation challenge, I think, is something that needs to be elevated. And so we've talked about, again, what are your key metrics? How do you know you're making headway? Who are who's going to need to do what? Have you done a kind of implementation chain study to say, for this new reading program or this new teacher training program or this new assessment system to take place, who at what level has to do what thing? And do we know whether they can do it? What are they going to need in order to do that well? Most policymakers don't spend very much time thinking about those things. So again, we ask them, have you thought about this? Have you thought about engaging these stakeholders so they know, yeah, we're on board, we can do our piece of this, we're confident that can be done? Or are they going to wake up in the morning and realize that they've been assigned some piece of work that they're not prepared to do, right? All right, last thing. Is that my last? I may be ahead of myself. All right, So, oh, and effectiveness, last one. So the effectiveness is we don't do a very good job of studying these pieces for impact, right? So we struggle with figuring out what are those metrics, what are those things we're going to move. We don't pass legislation that includes some way to study it, right? To some way to say this is actually working. We don't have the research pieces lined up. Some states have research entities, universities that do some of that, but it's typically not done where the effectiveness is studied deeply. So again, we ask our policymakers, like, if you thought about how you're going to do the research, who is going to be tracking these metrics? When the metrics show that we're not on, what do you intend to do about it? I mean, how are we going to ensure that this thing continues to have impact? How do you know if it's going to have impact, right? So those are kind of, and at very high level, you can see it. And if you read the reports, you'll get a sense of kind of the detail on that. But a couple of things on the tool, because I really do want to get a conversation about whether this tool achieves what we're trying to achieve around getting things done. So the way that we structured it is each of those sections has the little blurb, and then it has the questions. How well are you doing on this thing? And then we asked them to do a self-assessment. We had thought in the early part when we were first designing this, like, should we just do a checklist? Should we just say, did you, and like have them check that off? And actually, our experience at the Council of Chief State School Officers, we did a lot of work going into state education agencies. We built tools where we would help, for instance, if you became the new commissioner of education in some state, we would come in, we would sit down with you, we would say, what kind of goals do you have? And we would do what's called a capacity review. And the capacity review basically said, all right, do you have a good sense of what you're trying to do? Like, what are you even trying to do? When people come to work here, what are they doing? Does anybody, and if you as the state chief think that's what you're doing, does anybody else in this building think that that's what they're here to do? So what we would do is we would ask the state chief, what's your goal? What's your vision? And particularly the elected state chiefs, as you might imagine, popularly elected, because some state chiefs are elected as popularly elected, like a governor. Others are appointed by governors of state board. The elected chiefs were, because they'd had to campaign, were typically pretty good about, these are my 5 things. Boom, 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 boom. They could rattle them right off. They were good at that because they'd honed that message through a campaign. The problem is we would talk to the chief. Yep. Here's my thing. Here's our 5-step plan to turn around the schools in our state. But if you went 2 layers down into the agency and asked them, what are you doing here? What are your 4 things? They're like, I don't know. He's got a sign up in his office that says these 5 things. I don't, it doesn't really impact me. I don't know what to do. Right. So we would try to figure out. So what we would do is we would build a rubric very similar to this. We would sit down with the leadership team and we would ask them, what do you think? Do you think the people that work in this agency know what your vision is for the State Department? Do you think that they're working on that every day? And we would ask them. And so the self-assessment piece, we had a lot of success with. And so we like that better than just did you not? Because it makes them think, how well are we doing? Are we really doing this well? I don't know, maybe. And then we also have an evidence piece here, right? So we actually force them, that little spot at the bottom. You think you're to themselves, like, no, actually, I think we're excellent in that. All right, what's your evidence that you're excellent on those things? Do you have a research agenda or you solve a problem? So we built it in that way. And then we also have at the end, this piece, which is the next steps piece, which is, okay, you and your team sat around a table like this. You went through this exercise with this tool. You did this self-evaluation on all of these pieces. Now the question is, what are you going to do with it, right? Because we want them to be thinking about, okay, these were the areas. And when we did this process, a similar process to this at CCSSO, we actually gave them like green and yellow and red and orange indicators because they would do a self-assessment and we would do an assessment as an outside entity. And then we would match them up to see whether our evaluation of what they were doing and their evaluation was the same thing. So we asked them, where are you on this? And what are you going to do next, right? So what is the next step? Is there an area that needs more work? And then if so, who's going to do it? Because too often you walk away from a meeting and there's a decision made, yep, this needs to get done. All right, let's wrap up the meeting, right? You got to get to the who's going to do what, by when are they going to do it, right? SMART goal type things. And then the last part is, when are we going to reconvene? so we can figure out whether we've made any headway on these things that we decided. Maybe we walk through this assessment again, and then we can see whether we've made some headway. We went and engaged some stakeholders, or we did some more planning, or we engaged a research entity, or we did one of those kinds of things. So that's basically the tool. And this is my last slide, because I do want to get your sense of, like, does this feel like an effective tool to engage these policymakers? So as I said, the challenge is, how do we deliver actionable findings to policymakers in a way that balances simplicity, right? We want it to be easy to use. We don't want it to be a big, long, involved thing. We don't want it to be, you've got to bring in a consultant from outside for 5 weeks and have them going. Like, you got to have something that's pretty quick. I don't want to stand by the scientific rigor of this before you even ask me whether we've done any validity studies around. Like, this is just our best guess based on our experience and talking with our practitioners council about these are the kind of questions that people should be asking themselves around these things. But the key question is, how do we turn this research into action? So again, we wanted to be policy agnostic. If you want the policy piece, go into the Nation at Risk series and read those. Those will tell you what to do with early childhood, and what to do with governance, and what to do with these things, because the findings are all in there. There's one-pagers if you don't want to read the whole thing. So you can look at that and you can dig into what the policy is that you're trying to do. This document is specifically not trying to do that, right? We just, whatever your policy is you're trying to move forward, have you thought about these things? Easy, quick to use, lends itself to use by teams. We think that's pretty important. Our experience at CCSSO was, again, around teams like this, taking an afternoon or taking a couple of hours to sit and walk their way through this, have people do their own ratings and then compare ratings with each other, and argue about where they are, because people aren't going to see things that other people will see. So it's a way to get a team to build a consensus. So we wanted this to be a tool that a team could use together. And I also have fun. I'll leave it up to you whether this looks like a fun exercise or not, but we tried to make it, the original design idea was it was going to look like an old school report card, like report cards from the 70s kind of thing. And we did an initial draft of it, but if you remember those report cards, it was like all squares across because you had all the quarters, and we looked at them like, I don't know, it's too much on one page. And we're very fortunate that we have some very good designers at Hoover, and they're like, all right, actually we need more white space and let's break it up. And so I deferred to people who know way better than I do how to design things, but we tried to keep it something that didn't seem overwhelming when you sat down to do it. You should kind of go through quickly. And again, we wanted to be a quick kind of dipstick thing. Like, let's just check where we are right now around this particular piece of policy. And again, the self-assessment piece was, we didn't want to do a yes, no, we have, we haven't. We wanted to be a little more variable. And we wanted them to make a kind of qualitative assessment. Like we're kind of there, but we actually need to lean into that a little bit more than we did. And then the last thing is the next steps. We didn't want to leave it like, that's your assessment and you're done and moving on. We actually wanted people to go, okay, what are we going to do with this going forward? So I share all of that with you. And this is just, if you want to see it, you have it, but that's the QR code to go to the tool. I'll stop there, but because I'm happy to talk about it and I would love to get some feedback on it, but this is an example of a tool that we think is a way to take the research that we've done and make it into something that's digestible, that policymakers will actually use, who are otherwise super busy people. It lets them make judgments about themselves, right? It's not us coming in and saying, you should do this or you should do that, but it forces them, as they're sitting and figuring out how are we going to implement a new assessment thing, a new teacher training thing, whatever it is, to go through a series of questions that the research suggests to us. If they do it, they will improve their chances of making something happen effectively. I'm sure all of you have dealt with these kinds of tools before and have thought about, like, how do I make this actionable to policymakers? But we think this is a pretty good example of how that might be done. So I'm happy to stop there. Love to hear any feedback, questions, thoughts, because selfishly, I would love to continue to improve it and tweak it. And as we're doing other things like this going forward, whether a tool like this is something that we think would be effective. Thoughts, questions? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really very interesting to hear this. I'm from the Philippines.
Yeah.
I I used to work in the Department of Education. And all the eyes that you mentioned, that brought me back to
Right.
good and bad experience.
I know. I don't want to give anybody like some kind of seizure or something.
So,
Work
so
in
in that sense, I can say that it's not unique to the US. But my question is really, and I feel that the tool itself can be useful. Honestly, I think I'm already imagining that this would be good for policymakers. And the way I define policymakers would be legislators and people who run the executive
Yes.
part of government. My question is more in terms of timing. Like if you were to engage policymakers, given like you have short political cycles, 2 years for you, 3 years for us, or 6 years, and education reform takes so long. Like, what is the timing for this? Like, do you engage policymakers before they even run? When they're in office? When they're about to run for re-election? Because this has always been a challenge, and it's hard to get policymakers' attention for research in particular.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think like so much else in this business, it may be context dependent. You don't have, I mean, ideally, you have a legislator just got elected here on election day. They're going to be in office in January. In most of these places, they're going to have bills being written as we speak. And so you're right, there's not much of a window there to do this. This may be a little more useful for governors, because governors may have a little more lead time. They may, around where they're going to go. And so you hope that they kind of think, if these are my 3 big things that I ran on, can you think about some of these questions, how you're going to do the research piece, and how you're going to engage, what's the long-term play here, and how do you scale this over time? The other thing that happens, at least in my experience in Maine, when I was on the department side, is you make some allies on like the legislative committees. And we actually did, as a department, we did a kind of a strategic plan framework. We took it down and presented it to the legislature. And we were very fortunate that the Senate chair, we have one education committee that has House members and Senate members in Maine. The Senate chair of the committee sort of really embraced that. And he said to his fellow committee members, any bill that we see, I want to run it against this strategic plan and see if it fits or not. And if it doesn't fit, I don't think we should do it. And he used it as a kind of a tool. And you wonder whether if you could engage, because those of you who know legislative process and know the committee level is where the sausage is made, right? The bills are done by the time you get to the floors. There's not much happens there. If you can get like committee staff and committee leads to spend some of that time, sometimes legislative staff. So most legislatures employ a bipartisan staff that works for the legislature that helps legislators draft bills. And hopefully the legislative staff gets pretty good at when a legislator comes in and says, I want a bill that does this. Those staff members, I always admired their patience, because you have no idea what kind of ideas people come in with about a piece of legislation that then that staff has to figure out some way to either talk them out of or figure out how to adapt in some way, right? So you'd like to think maybe if you had tools like this that were out, that a legislative staffer or even the partisan leadership inside a legislative staff could say, all right, let's think about this. We're going to move something big like a charter school bill or something. Like, have we gone through these things? But it depends a little bit on the context of whatever the situation is inside that state. But it's a great question. It's a tough one too. Yeah, thank you.
It strikes me that this is a very interesting tool, but it doesn't seem quite complete.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of it from the perspective of the staff person, of the legislator, who is not an expert,
Right.
who has not read the research, and then goes through this and wants to know, okay, what do you provide me that gives me answers that I can use? For example,
Right.
So much, as you correctly stated,
Yeah.
education is context dependent. If I'm trying to decide whether something I've heard about across the country is going to work in my district,
Yeah.
do you give me research that analyzes not just the result of the success of what they did over there, but why it was successful. So I can answer the question, is it going to work in my district?
Right. Well, the question there is, who is the you in that scenario?
Staff member, the new legislator.
Yeah.
is inexperienced,
Yeah.
doesn't have the research background, hasn't read the research.
Right, yeah. I think part of that, part of the question, if you're a staffer to the legislator is, where did you even get this idea from? Like, where is this coming from, right?
The time, the post.
Right, yeah, and so, right, it could be, or, they go to conferences, right? And as a lot of folks do, you go to conferences, you hear these ideas, and they will, it's funny because I know from when I was at CCSSO, working with the state education chiefs, they would always say, I get really anxious when my education legislators go to conferences. I always try to go with them or send a staffer with them because I want to hear what they are hearing, because I know they're going to come back from these conferences with some cockamamie idea that I have to then deal with. I think the question of the research to some degree falls on, there's a lot of advocacy organizations that are moving a lot of these things, right? Hey, we should do third grade reading, or we should do charter schools, or we should do education savings accounts. If I'm a legislator, I think, and I'm thinking about this, my next phone call is back to advocacy organizations, is to the folks in these other states. All right, tell me more about how you did this. How did you implement it? Who are the people?
But that's not really what you were saying people would do. You said that people would, because this is policy agnostic,
Right.
that they would go to the research that you provide. And I'm wondering, does the research you provide answer the questions that you're asking them to address?
Does the research we're providing at Hoover provide them with?
Exactly.
Okay. I'm sorry. That was the part I was struggling with. In some instances, probably yes. In some instances, probably no. That's a good point. So the question would be, the challenge would be for that legislative staff and the team of folks who are working on that to figure out, are there other pieces we should access around that? And again, I go to the advocacy organizations because they're the ones that sort of are the conveners of that research and pull those things together. And so it may be that, it may be engaging again at these conferences with folks from other states. I mean, Hoover will have some of that. Hartford will have some of that. I mean, there will be research elements out there. I think you're raising a good question about what is the funnel by which all of this research that's floating around get into policymakers? I think that's a challenge. And you'd like to think that there's legislative staff. I mean, in each of the committees, at least in my experience in Maine, there is committee level staff that does have some expertise, right? They're not just a committee staffer, but they actually have a background in that space. They kind of know the players in that space. They know the research issues. So you'd like to think that those folks are there. But it may also fall to the legislators on those committees, or the governor's education policy advisor, or somebody in that policymaking ecosystem that's going to have to do the work of pulling together the threads of research that support the position that they're going in. But it's going to be a mix of things coming through the door. That's part of the challenge. Yeah.
I've got two, I don't know if they're questions or points, but more so just on the
Yeah.
side of feedback on the tool. I think first, I'm always generally a little hesitant about self-assessments when
Yeah.
other things, like the questions about how would you grade yourself, which
Yeah.
when you explain more about this,
Yeah.
it's supposed to be a team sort of exercise. So if there's discrepancies,
Right.
that aspect of it
Yeah.
made more sense to me. But I'm wondering if there might be a digital version of this tool where you guys sort of automatically add up points based on whether folks check these boxes or not.
Right.
And then it gives folks sort of like on the team, be like, oh, we got a 80 on this. And then half the other team is like, my output gave us a 55.
Right.
So wondering if there's
I
a
see.
mechanism for that. I also come from more of a quant background, so that
Yeah.
might be my bias
Right.
coming in there. So even if it's still sort of everyone subjectively looking at the same assessment and making their I guess assessments about each of these challenges, there's still that one
Yeah.
data point that they can more easily compare. And the second
I like
point was about more so like flexibility and adaptability. I'm wondering if teams who want to take a more in-depth approach to this. So there might be not more advanced, that sounds a little weird, but like a section where like for example, on challenge 1, box 1, it says you have evidence or research demonstrating that the proposed reform will address the targeted issue.
Right.
And so maybe there's like for people who want to get more into it, there can be like tiers of like, I have a randomized control trial
right.
where the significance level is such and such, or I have anecdotal evidence from 5 superintendents that I've worked with, or I have, you know, a general research study, but there's no experimental aspect to that study. And I'm wondering, like, I mean, if the goal is to get this done relatively quickly without getting too into the weeds, then I can understand how like this is very useful for that. But I'm wondering if there are teams that do want a more in-depth version, if
Could you
your team
build
is
like the
approving-
next level down that's a little more?
Exactly.
Or could you, to the electronic thing, could you do it where you click it and it opens up a sub
drop-down
menu
menu,
that says, right?
Because I was
I think you're
thinking,
trying to hit the right spot where you are going a little deeper, but you don't make it overwhelming where they just go, I can't go through 1,000 questions here."
exactly.
Yeah.
And so, maybe like
Yeah.
levels of
Yeah.
complexity, depending on how
Right.
much effort a team wants to put.
Right. Or it may be that the leadership team, like when we would go into states and do this, it would be the commissioner, it would be the deputy commissioners, it would be the senior level staff, the chief academic officer. I mean, those are basically the cabinet level staff would be doing this. But you wonder whether you couldn't, there is some kind of cross check with folks maybe a layer down in the organization who are the curriculum experts or the assessment experts, who they would get this and go, actually, we're nowhere on this. What is he talking about? That's not the right, like, we don't have that at all. And maybe it's a good check internally to the agency to think about maybe the C-suite people don't have as good a grip on the capabilities further down inside the agency that they have. But I like the idea of, is there a stepped structure to this? Or is there a spin-off that says, I don't know the answer to this question. I don't have the data to answer this. Who has some expertise inside this agency, or a colleague in another state agency who might have more of this information we can access that would tell us where to score ourselves here, because we don't have enough information to answer this question. Okay, yeah.
Building,
Yeah.
evaluating and how that's being communicated between which tiers of decision makers. I think it's a really cool tool, and I really respect and can see the way in which you formulated it to be policy agnostic. But I think my question is kind of thinking through where you think the weaknesses are or flexibility that you could build in terms of an understanding that a lot of educational policies are very polemic kind of inherently, especially when you start thinking about different stakeholders in terms of teachers or administrators or parents, in addition to political leaders. And especially in our current environment, I think that's especially true. And how do you envision this tool, which I think is very oriented towards analysis and planning and cohesion, interacting with the sort of chaotic elements.
The political.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I mean, there's a couple places where we touch on that. I mean, we do ask in there, like, do you have a bipartisan coalition that's going to, if your intent is, and again, you're right, the presumption of this is that the intent is that it is a long-lasting reform that goes to scale and has real impact. It doesn't appropriately allow for, I just want to throw a stick of dynamite into the room. It's sort of, and raise an issue. I'm not particularly interested in the long-term impact. So you're right. I wonder if it makes me think whether there's an initial screen or something that says this really is, I don't want to say a serious policy, but somebody who's not interested in just sort of creating rancor for the sake of creating it, but actually wants to have a long-term impact. And that may back into the papers that we've written that says, if you really want to have impact, you have to do these kinds of things. So maybe there is a yes/no decision tree, like, if this presumes your intent is to have that kind of impact. And I don't know if you even bother to build a tool. If it's not, why would you even want to do that? But it's an interesting push. Yeah, we'd have to think about how to account for that so that there's there's a self-assessment here that's genuine and is not driven by, right, an ulterior motive of some kind.
It goes the other way too.
Yeah.
I think if you're a policymaker who's trying to affect some sort of structural change, but
Yeah.
you're confronting advocacy
Yeah.
groups that are in opposition to you and
Right.
might have different tactics they deploy, or even in a more genuine sense, evidence that they find credible that you don't.
Yes.
Versa.
Right.
How do you solve?
Right. Yeah, and that's, I think that's going to go back to the coalition building and the engagement. And it does go to the question of where does the research come from that is driving this, and is that relevant research? And I think that goes to a larger problem that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which is the challenge of getting research that is valid and reliable in the hands of policymakers in this sort of fractured landscape. And I think, places like Hoover, our scholars are serious academics. They're very careful about what they do. I mean, what's been interesting to me as a non-academic coming in and working with these folks is particularly because I have a policymaker lens, and my job is like, how can we make this useful to some state legislator someplace? And my research friends are great about this is what the evidence says. And particularly on like the Nation at Risk plus 40 papers, we specifically asked, what are your recommendations for policymakers? And as you might imagine, we had folks bridle at that a little bit. They're like, well, look, this is what the research says. Like, this is what the data tells us. To go the added step of saying, that means that you as a policymaker should do this, this, and this. I'm not going to go that far. So that's been interesting for me, again, as a non-academic, to go, okay, I get that they're not prepared to step out beyond where the research is going to go. So that does make it hard to make that last, when they build the bridges from the two ends, and they sort of like to close that gap in the middle is a challenge. It's a challenge. Yep.
Yeah, the spirit of feedback.
Yeah,
So
please.
it really makes sense to me that this would be directed towards state policymakers.
Yeah.
I mean, given like how
I know,
education works in this
right.
country. But like a lot of decisions get made at the district
Yeah.
level, for example.
Yes.
Especially like very large.
Big districts. Yeah. Huge
Big
districts. Yeah.
And so I was just curious if you all thought about adapting this. Like so much would be
Yeah.
totally relevant. Still,
Right.
But then you would also
Yeah,
need
no,
to
you're
think
right.
about like, constraints that you have.
Yeah. I think at this stage, I mean, we only got this out a few weeks ago, and we made the mistake of kind of rolling this in the run up to an election. So probably wasn't the best timing, but we're sharing it with folks like you guys. We're taking it to NGA. We're going to shop it around and kind of give presentations and have people give it a try. I think we want to establish a kind of proof of concept here a little bit, but you're absolutely right. I mean, we've got districts way bigger than state education. I mean, the state of Maine has 170,000 kids, K-12. Like there's plenty of school districts bigger than that. So yeah, there's absolutely an opening, I think, for a district level tool that you're right would match some of this. I don't think it would be a lot to adapt it, but that certainly would be down the road. We'd love to do that. Yeah, it's a great idea. Yeah.
I was also thinking, I've seen a lot of tools get a lot of criticism over people for misunderstanding what the intent of the tool is.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if either like shield you guys from like unwarranted criticism, or like even just for like transparency's sake with people who are using this, if there could potentially be like a box at the beginning or something like that that says, this is what this tool is supposed to help you do,
Yeah.
and this is what it will not help you do.
Yeah.
At least like for me, even if it doesn't necessarily improve how people are using it, I think that has helped me a lot in I haven't designed like educational tools,
Right.
but like in communicating to the public or stakeholders about like what we're trying to do. I've found that it's also helpful to say what we're not trying to do. Because a lot of people
Yeah.
will be like, well, it should do this and this and this, and be like, maybe we'll do that another time, maybe that'll
Yeah,
be another
that's a good
tool.
question.
But right now, this is what it is. Can you,
Yeah, that's great. And again, as we're sort of, I don't know if soft launch is the right word, but as we're thinking about and getting feedback from folks, that may be a piece that we need to, I need to keep an ear out for that. If they're like, wait a second, I thought it was going to do this and it didn't really do that at all. And we may also run into issues like the research issue, like we don't have enough information to even answer that question. How are we supposed to answer that question? So there's going to be pieces that we'll get pushback on, but I think again, my job is to try and figure out how to get this research into the hands of folks who will actually execute it. I think it's going to take some trial and error to do that. Like I said, the way this is structured is based a lot on our experience when I was at CCSO working with state chiefs. It's based on feedback from our practitioners council, which is some district level folks, but also state level folks. That these are the kind of questions, these kind of things that seem to get overlooked. But yeah, I think as we continue to refine it, we may need to draw some brighter boundaries around, like it's
So
specific
Stephen,
to.
I sort of have a question about the two parts of your presentation. Because the first part of the presentation sort of said, you know, Nation at Risk had big objectives, transform the educational system, and we weren't able to do very much. So we
Mhm.
looked at various pieces, preschool, accountability,
Mhm.
various teacher
Teacher training, yep.
interventions and so forth. But this, but really, these are big things,
Yep.
right? These weren't things for a little, somebody newly elected to a state legislature to deal. These were, you know, national.
Yep.
You know, nationwide kinds of interventions. And so I think the issues there are very different from
Mhm.
the kinds of things that the, you know, strategic suggestions you have,
Yep.
which are really very interesting, but seem to me more like, okay, if we want to get schools to have a better school schedule instead of the school schedules that we currently have, which are often crazy, you can probably get everybody to agree, we need a new school schedule that will actually work, and we need to know how to prepare our school schedules.
Mhm.
And if somebody could come up with a design for that, we'd say, yes, everybody would agree to that. But it seems like this is designed to deal with sort of small scale questions, not the big scale questions. And I'm not saying one is better than the
Yep.
other. I'm just saying that those are two different worlds, and the politics around it, the strategic planning and so forth
Mhm.
are really quite different. I mean, the biggest issues out there today are we going to get more money for teachers? Are we going to increase teacher salaries? You know, the people are working very hard on that front, right? And people are saying we got to have more choice. We have to have education savings accounts. That's probably the biggest thing out there. Maybe charter school expansion. Well, those are big issues, but I don't see the tool addressing that kind of topic. But maybe I'm missing something.
Well, I think what the tool reflects is that the big movements, third grade reading or universal pre-K, those are national reform agenda items that are being executed at the state level. So I think, I don't know, at least in my experience working with the states, and who knows under the new administration, what will happen, but I don't think anybody's looking to Washington to lead a national level initiative around some of those things. So the challenge is, if you've decided we're going to lean into high quality instructional materials, there are some states that have done good work on that. And what we find is that states are inclined to say, well, Louisiana did really well with that, so we'll just do what Louisiana did. And what we're saying is, even when these things work in places, we don't have a lot of success transplanting that to someplace else. And unless we think there's going to be a big state, somehow federal presence, the way high quality instructional materials is going to sweep through the country is one state at a time. And so the tool is kind of built to get you to think about, okay, if we want to do that here, how are we going to do the implementation piece? What's the data how are we going to train the teachers? What's the long-term coalition building that we need to do? These kinds of things that we're trying to address here, because it is going to be state to state to state to state, unless we think, and I love views from folks, whether we think there's going to be we're going back to some type of big federal push around some of these things. I don't know. I don't see it coming. We've got an administration that's wants to take apart the Department of Education, as we talked about this morning. So in the absence of a big federal presence that's doing these things nationwide, I don't know how else we're gonna do it other than
Well,
state by
yeah,
state by
no,
state
I
by
was
state.
thinking of a federal initiative, although in fact, it could be the Trump administration will try to do something in the
Yeah.
choice domain.
Yeah, almost certainly.
But, you know, there are all kinds of advocacy groups out
Yep.
there behind each of these policies. And they develop model legislation. And they have strategic context, contact
Yep.
in every state. And so there are nationwide organizations that are pushing particular
That's right.
policy proposals and coming up with strategies
Mhm.
for implementing
Yep.
those proposals in some considerable detail. So if I were a legislator, I would basically want to, you know, make a contact with whatever my policy was that I want. I'd look around and see, you know, what's the advocacy group that's pushing this thing?
Yep.
And they'll probably supply me with a lot of those tools.
They could, yep. And it may be that that's where some of this comes from. So if you go to, so Jeb Bush's organization, Excellent Ed, I mean, they do a lot of third grade reading. They did 8F report cards. They're very big on cell phone bans. I mean, they will jump on things. They will go into states. They will write model legislation. They will help build coalitions. I mean, there are organizations that do that. And I think it may be that if you're a policymaker doing this, you're writing in the margins, well, they'll help us with this. We'll get this from them. We'll get this from this group over here. But if you're an opponent, right, then you're also going to be like, well, where's this idea coming? Oh, I know where it came from. It came from his organization or that organization or the Koch brothers or whoever it came from. And it may be that that's how that happens. But you're right. There are national organizations that are moving these things forward and they may be able to solve some of this, but the hope is that you're at least thinking about, all right, do we have an answer to that question? Because if we don't, then we need to find somebody who can help us with that specific piece.
It's related to the point about how it's framed.
Yeah.
I think the title also says a lot about expectations when I look at this. So because it says education reform, self-assessment.
Yeah.
Then I'm looking at, I think one is, am I looking at large scale reform?
Yeah.
And then two, is it an assessment or is it really, because my impression at the onset was more of a checklist, checkpoint, or you know, whatever you want to call it, more than like an assessment. So the benefit comes more from, if I'm a first time legislator, if I'm a first time state level person, is this how I approach policy making? Is there a right way of approaching it? And you're correct, it doesn't tell you whether it's the right policy or the wrong policy. But it just tells me how am I identifying the policies, prioritizing which policy to push for over the myriad of policies. So it's more of like a checklist to me rather than an assessment of myself per se.
Right.
Because there's, again, if it's a self-assessment, then you start looking for quantitative measures, reliability, but you know, and all
Yeah.
things. Then, but it's really more a qualitative process of how do I arrive at prioritizing which policy to push for.
Right.
So that's the value to me.
Yeah.
And then
Interesting.
I guess the title has to be consistent with, as he said, what are you trying to push for?
Right.
And what you want to get out of it as a whoever the audience.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about the prioritization aspect of that, which is that a governor comes in and has 5 things that they said they wanted to get done in education. You use a tool like this to take each of those policies in turn and run through it. And presumably the more checks, the higher, you know, the more checks you make, and that may be the policy you run with, because you do have support from an outside group. You've got all the research pieces, you've got all these other pieces, and that may help you direct to, at this moment in time, we've got some running room in this area because we've got a lot of these, but whereas this other one, we're just not ready for prime time on this. Like, we're going to have to take 2 years and build some coalitions and do some research and go talk to some other states. And it may be because you didn't land where you wanted to land, like that one's, we're just not baked on that one. So we're going to start with this one and then we'll get to those other ones down the road. I like that idea of, and maybe there is a wraparound or another version of this, right? That's like, here are your 3 policy things, you rate them all. And then the thing comes back and says, this is the one that has the best chance, given your your partisan situation, your access to data and research that supports what you're trying to do. Yeah, that's interesting.
Well, Stephen, thank you very much.
Yes,
for
thank you. I appreciate the feedback. Thank you, guys.
And
Super
thank you all for coming. This is the final seminar for this term, but we will have another PepG seminar series beginning in the spring term. So we will be sending you information on our speakers list and our timing for the second term. So stay tuned. So thank you.
Great.